She came to him on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning West Texas made in late October when the sky was the color of smoke and the wind moved low across the ground like it was looking for something to knock over. She came on foot, which in that country meant she had either lost her horse or never had one, and she was wearing a dress that had once been blue, but was now the color of old dust. She stood at the edge of the yard, 30 feet from the porch, and she did not come closer. She just waited. And he watched her from the doorway of the house he had built with his own hands. A man of middle years with arms that looked carved from cedar. And he watched her the way a man watches something he has not yet decided what to do about. Her name was Clara Voss. She was 29 years old. The left side of her face carried a burn scar that ran from the edge of her jaw, up past her cheekbone and into her hairline. Old enough to be settled into the skin, but still dark enough in certain light to make strangers look away. She had learned, in the years since the fire that took the farmstead outside Abilene where she had grown up, that the world offered a woman with a face like hers exactly two options. She could hide, or she could keep walking forward and let people turn away if that was what they needed to do. She had been walking forward for 3 years. She had tried the dress shops in Abilene. She had tried the laundry in Sweetwater. She had tried the rooming house in Colorado City, where the woman who ran it said she was sorry, but the other boarders would find her unsettling. She had tried not to think too hard about what that meant. She had tried a great many things, and in every case, the door had either been closed in front of her or had never opened at all. And now she stood at the edge of a yard in Mitchell County, Texas, in the year 1873, because a man in Colorado City had told her that the black rancher west of town sometimes hired people when nobody else would, and she had decided that was worth a 2-day walk to find out. He came off the porch and walked toward her slowly, not rushing the way he moved around the cattle. He stopped about 10 feet from her. "You looking for work?" he said. It was not quite a question. "I am." "What kind?" "Whatever kind you need done." He looked at her for a long moment without any expression she could read. The wind moved between them, carrying dust and the smell of the cattle pens to the south. His name was Bose Ikard, and he had built this small ranch on the edges of Parker County, and he understood something about being looked past. "Can you cook?" he said. "Well enough." "Can you mend tack?" "I can learn." He looked at the sky briefly, as if checking something, then looked back at her. "Come in," he said. "There's coffee." She followed him onto the porch and through the door, and when she passed through the threshold, she stopped for just a moment, because she had half expected him to say something about her face, and he had not said anything at all. She sat at the table. He set a tin cup in front of her and poured, and then sat across from her. "Why did you hire me?" she whispered. He wrapped both hands around his own cup. "Because no one else would," he said. He said it the way a man states the direction of north, not as pity, not as charity, as a fact he had observed and was simply naming out loud. If you're watching this on your television and you've been meaning to subscribe, now is the time. Subscribing and sharing this story with someone who needs it is what keeps this channel alive and helps more voices like this one reach more people. It costs nothing and means everything. Thank you. To understand Bose Ikard, you have to understand what the Goodnight-Loving Trail was, because Bose Ikard and that trail cannot be fully separated. The trail opened on June 6, 1866, when former Texas Ranger Charles Goodnight and cattle runner Oliver Loving set out from just west of Fort Belknap on the Brazos River in Young County, Texas, with 18 cowhands and 2,000 head of Texas Longhorns, the first chuck wagon ever built, designed by Goodnight himself from a surplus army wagon, rolled out with them. The route moved southwest through some of the most hostile terrain in North America, crossing 80 miles of waterless desert before reaching the Pecos River, then north through New Mexico to Fort Sumner, eventually extending all the way to Colorado and Wyoming. Men and cattle died on it with regularity across its roughly 20 years of active use. Bose Ikard was among the crew on that first drive. He had been born into slavery in Noxubee County, Mississippi, around 1843, and the family who enslaved him eventually moved to Parker County, Texas. where Bose grew up on the edge of the frontier, learning cattle work with the thoroughness of someone who has no margin for error. The Civil War ended and left him a free man. Freedom in West Texas in 1865 was a complicated condition. Legal, yes, but surrounded on all sides by the apparatus of a world that had only recently decided to stop treating a man like livestock, and which was still working out exactly how much it meant, what it had decided. Bose made his choices in that terrain anyway. He went to work for Oliver Loving as a trail driver in 1866, and within the first days of the trail, there was a horse that needed breaking. Several men had tried and been thrown. Bose said he could do it. He got on the horse, and when it would not stop bucking, he bit the animal on its neck, hard enough to startle it into stillness. It was the kind of thing that either gets a man laughed at or establishes him permanently. In Bose Ikard's case, it established him. From that moment, Charles Goodnight understood he had someone exceptional. Oliver Loving died in 1867 in New Mexico from wounds he received when Comanche attacked him on the trail. He had gone ahead of the main herd alone and paid for it. Bose continued with Goodnight for 4 more years, serving not just as cowboy and tracker, but as what Goodnight himself called his de facto banker, carrying thousands of dollars in cash across territory where theft and violence were routine. Trusted absolutely because trust had been absolutely earned. Goodnight later said of him, in words that have been preserved and verified across multiple historical sources, that he trusted Bose Ikard farther than any living man. He said there was a dignity, a cleanliness, and a reliability about him that was wonderful. He said Bose surpassed any man he had in endurance and stamina. These are not words a man from Goodnight's time and place offered freely or lightly to anyone, and certainly not to a black man in the 1860s and 1870s. They meant something specific. They were earned over years on some of the worst terrain on the continent, under conditions that pressed men down to what they actually were made of. By the time Clara Voss appeared at the edge of his yard in the early 1870s, Bose had moved on from the trail drives and was building his own place. The small ranch was not grand, but it was his, and he ran it with the same relentless attention to competence that had defined everything he had done since emancipation. He had married a woman named Angeline. He had children. He understood what it cost a person to build something from nothing, and he understood what it cost a person to be seen as less before they had even opened their mouths. Which is why, when Clara Voss stood in his yard, he did not look at her face. He looked at her hands, which told him she had worked hard in her life. He looked at how she held her shoulders, which told him she had been turned away from many doors and had not crumbled. He looked at the fact that she had walked 2 days to get there, which told him something that no amount of conversation could have communicated. And then he told her to come in. The days that followed were quiet in the way frontier life is always quiet. Not peaceful, exactly, but full of a kind of relentless work that leaves little room for excess talk. Clara learned the rhythms of the place. She cooked. She mended. She learned to handle the tack under the instruction of one of Bose's older hands, a former freedman named Samuel, who taught her how to check a cinch for wear, how to read a horse's mood from the way it held its ears, and how to clean a bit properly. Because a woman who knew those things was useful in a way that a woman who did not know them was not. Why does he keep taking people in? She asked Samuel one evening while they worked. Samuel pushed his hat back on his head. Same reason the trail does what it does. He said, it goes where other trails won't. She thought about that. But he could say no. He could. So why doesn't he? Samuel set down the piece of bridle he was working. You ever been somewhere where nobody looks you in the eye? He said. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Then you know, he said. The thing about a burn scar in the 1870s was that it was not merely an aesthetic matter. Women in that era depended almost entirely on either family structures or domestic employment to survive. And both of those avenues required a degree of social acceptability that Clara Voss no longer possessed. In most places she tried. She was not unintelligent. She had grown up on a working farm and knew the difference between a good season and a bad one. None of that mattered to the woman at the rooming house in Colorado City. What mattered to that woman was what the other boarders would think. The cruelty of it was not dramatic. It arrived quietly, in one closed door after another, in the way people looked just past her left shoulder in conversation, in the way certain jobs were never offered because they required her face to be a certain kind of face. There was no law against any of it. There was just the accumulated weight, which a person either learns to carry or is crushed by. And Clara Voss had decided not to be crushed. But carrying it had taken something out of her. By the time she reached Bose Ikard's yard, she had been carrying it for 3 years, and it had begun to get heavier than she had expected. 2 weeks into her time at the ranch, she was in the kitchen before dawn when Bose came in for coffee. They were alone. The fire in the stove was already going, and the light was the dark, warm orange of early morning. "Don't you see my scar?" she said. She had not planned to say it. It came out the way things come out when a person has held them too long. He poured his coffee. He did not look at her differently than he had the day she arrived. "I see it," he said. "Most people. I know what most people do," he said. "I'm not most people." He sat down. "You do your work." "I do." "Oh, then we understand each other," he said. It was not a speech. It was not comfort in the way people usually offer comfort. It was something harder and more durable than comfort. The acknowledgement that she was present, that she had worth, that the work she did was real and was seen, and that the scar on her face did not change the calculation. In a world that had spent 3 years telling her she did not fully belong anywhere, it was the most useful thing anyone had said to her. The winter of 1873 came down hard across West Texas. Not as catastrophic as the terrible winter that would descend 13 years later, in 1886 and 1887, when temperatures across the range fell so low that hundreds of thousands of cattle died from Texas to Montana, and the open-range cattle industry was effectively broken. A disaster historians later marked as the beginning of the end of the classic frontier era. But hard enough. The water troughs iced over at night. The cattle pressed together in the corners of the pens. The work of keeping the ranch functioning required every person to contribute more than they had expected. Clara rode out with Samuel to check the east fence line, something she had not been asked to do before, but which Samuel needed help with because 2 hands were down sick. She learned she was not afraid of the cold the way she had thought. She learned she had a steadiness in the saddle she hadn't known about. She learned that cattle, up close, responded to calm the same way a skittish horse responded to calm, with gradual, watchful trust. She also learned something about Bose Ikard's history that nobody had volunteered. A passing drover who recognized Bose from the trail days mentioned, the way people mention things they assume are already known, that Bose had ridden the first Goodnight-Loving Trail drive, had served as Goodnight's personal banker and tracker, and had been in 3 armed engagements with Comanche during his years on the trail. All of this had been noted, the drover said, on a marker that Goodnight intended to one day place at Bose's grave, though Bose was still very much alive, and the marker was a future thing, a thing Goodnight had apparently already thought about. She found this out and did not know what to do with it for several days. She had understood that Bose was a man of ability. She had not fully grasped the scale of what he had done or the conditions under which he had done it. She had not known about the waterless 80-mile crossing through the Texas desert. She had not known about Loving's death and the Comanche attacks and the thousands of dollars carried across hostile territory. She had seen a man who ran a small ranch and hired people. Others turned away, and it turned out that man had ridden through some of the hardest country on the continent and been trusted with the kind of responsibility that most men of his era were never offered and would never deserve. She found him at the south fence one afternoon. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. He looked up from what he was working on. "Tell you what? About the trail, about Goodnight, about all of it." He went back to the post. "Because it doesn't matter what I was," he said. "It matters what I do." She stood in the cold for a moment. "It matters to me," she said. He paused. "Why?" "Because I needed to understand," she said, "that a person can come from something terrible and build something real. He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved across the pasture, carrying the smell of ice and grass and far-off rain. "Now you do," he said. Spring came back to West Texas the way it always does in that country. Not gently, but suddenly, like a door thrown open. The mesquite leafed out. The cattle moved with more energy. Clara Voss had been at the ranch 7 months. She had become, in the quiet way that competence accumulates, indispensable. Showing up every day, doing what was asked without complaint, and noticing the things that were not being asked and doing those too. She managed the household accounts with a precision that surprised even Bose. She had developed what Samuel called a gift with the horses, meaning it could not be fully taught, only observed and trusted. She had also begun slowly to look different to herself. Not her face, that did not change, but the way she held herself. The way she walked to the edge of the yard in the morning and looked at the land without bracing for what might come at her next. One evening in late March, she sat on the porch alone. Bose came out and sat in the other chair, and they watched the light go down over the land without speaking for a long time, which was something they had learned to do comfortably. "Do I really belong here?" she said finally. He did not answer immediately. "You've been carrying that question for a while." "Since the first day." "Yeah," he said. "I know." He let the silence run. "You belong here," he said. "You've belonged here since the 2nd week. You just didn't know it yet." "How did you know?" "Because you stopped waiting for me to tell you to leave," he said. "People who don't belong somewhere are always ready to leave. You stopped being ready." She looked at the darkening land. "I didn't notice that," she said. "I did," he said. "The historical record of the American West is full of people who were present and powerful and necessary, and who were then systematically removed from the story told afterward. Bose Ikard is one of them. He rode some of the hardest trail in the history of the American cattle industry, served as the personal trustee of one of the most powerful ranchers in Texas, participated in 3 documented armed engagements with Comanche, and was described by Charles Goodnight, in words preserved across more than a century of historical record, as among the most capable and trustworthy men he had ever known. 1 in 4 cowboys in the post-Civil War American West was black. That figure has been documented by historians and is corroborated by period census records and accounts. The work of the frontier was done disproportionately by people whose names the dime novels and the Hollywood films would spend the next century not mentioning. The Goodnight-Loving Trail, which ran from Fort Belknap on the Brazos River southwest through the waterless desert to Horsehead Crossing on the Pecos River, north to Fort Sumner in New Mexico, and eventually to Cheyenne, Wyoming, was opened by a crew that included a man born in Mississippi into bondage, who became the most trusted member of the outfit that built one of the most consequential cattle routes in American history. That is not sentiment. That is the documented record. Fort Belknap, the starting point of that trail, was established on June 24, 1851, along the Brazos River in Young County. It was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1960. Its restored buildings still stand today as a county park, with a cemetery that holds some of the most complex histories in Texas. In late April, a supply rider stopped at the gate with a letter for Clara, forwarded through 2 other stops from a cousin in Abilene who had been looking for her. Clara read the letter and put it in her pocket, and did not speak for an hour. When she found Bose, he was in the horse pen. "Someone knows where I am," she said. "Good or bad. Cousin, she wants to know if I'm all right." "Are you?" Clara looked at him. "Yes," she said. "More than I've been in a long time." He nodded. "Write her back," he said. "Tell her you're working. And if she asks where, tell her you're where you belong." Something in Clara's face shifted quietly, the way a thing shifts that has been held in tension for so long that when it releases, there is almost no sound. "You know," she said, "the first day I asked you why you hired me, I remember. Do you still think it was only because no one else would? He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. I think I hired you because I could see what you were carrying, and I thought you could put some of it down if you had somewhere solid to stand. She looked at him. Do you finally know why I hired you? He said. And she did. Bose Ikard died in Austin on January 4th, 1929, at roughly 85 years of age. He was buried in the Greenwood Cemetery in Weatherford, Texas. Charles Goodnight paid for and erected the granite marker himself and wrote the epitaph himself because he had thought about what to say for a long time and wanted it to be right. The marker reads, Bose Ikard served with me 4 years on the Goodnight-Loving Trail, never shirked a duty or disobeyed an order, rode with me in many stampedes, participated in 3 engagements with Comanches. Splendid behavior. Splendid behavior. From a man of Goodnight's background and era, it was not understatement. It was the highest tribute compressed into 2 words by someone who believed in compression. The trail Bose helped open lasted roughly 20 years. In that time, it moved hundreds of thousands of cattle across terrain that regularly killed men who underestimated it. It required the kind of competence that does not bend to the social categories applied to the people who have it. And the man who carried Goodnight's money through the worst of that country, who rode in 3 engagements with Comanche, who broke an unbreakable horse by biting it on the neck, that man went home afterward and built something of his own, on his own land, and ran it with the same uncompromising attention to what was real and what was earned. Aspects of his life inspired the fictional character Joshua Dietz in Larry McMurtry's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, Lonesome Dove, published in 1985, a book that would eventually make the Goodnight-Loving Trail famous to millions of people who never knew the real man who wrote it first. Clara Voss wrote to her cousin that spring. She told her that she was working, that the work was real, and that she had found a place that did not require her to look a certain kind of way in order to be worth something. She described the land instead of the particulars. The way the Brazos country looked in the spring, the way the horses moved in the morning, the way the work felt when it was going well. She signed the letter with her full name, which she had not done in some time, because for a while her name had felt like something belonging to a person who no longer existed. But she wrote it now, all of it, because it turned out she was still that person, or had become her again, or had perhaps become something more. Built on the same foundation but with more floors and better ground beneath them. 1 in 4 cowboys was black. History took a long time to say that clearly, but the land remembers. The granite markers remember. And sometimes, if you know where to look, the doors that were opened in spite of everything are still quietly, stubbornly open. Historical note: Bose Ikard, approximately 1843-1929, was a real historical figure. The documented facts in this story: his birth into slavery in Mississippi, his participation in the first Goodnight-Loving Trail drive in 1866, his role as Charles Goodnight's de facto banker and tracker, his participation in 3 engagements with Comanche, his lifelong friendship with Goodnight, and the epitaph Goodnight placed on his grave in Weatherford's Greenwood Cemetery, are all verified by multiple historical sources, including the Texas State Historical Association, the National Park Service, and blackpass.org. Clara Voss and Samuel are fictional characters created as narrative vehicles for this story. Fort Belknap, the Goodnight-Loving Trail, Horsehead Crossing on the Pecos River, Fort Sumner in New Mexico, and Weatherford's Greenwood Cemetery are all real locations. The catastrophic winter of 1886-1887, which devastated the open-range cattle industry, is historically documented. Larry McMurtry's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel Lonesome Dove, 1985, was partly inspired by the real lives of Charles Goodnight, Oliver Loving, and Bose Ikard.